Welcome to Charts This Week. My name's David Linton, I run Updata, and this week's edition comes to you for Monday the 15th of February from London. But we will be at eWorld in Essen in Germany this week, so if you want to come and chat to me about markets, you will find me on the Thomson Reuters stand in the main hall. And indeed, Updata is running here on Thomson Reuters icon, so the great thing about Updata, of course, it will sit on lots of different data services, and increasingly Thomson Reuters icon is the system I use for energy markets. Of course, you could be using Bloomberg or Thomson Reuters. It doesn't really matter which, but for now, here we are running on Thomson Reuters icon. So these crude prices coming directly off the Thomson Reuters platform, and with Updata Analytics we get to apply a higher degree of analysis. So we start as always by looking at the oil market, and we're seeing a recovery in crude prices, big recovery on Friday in the price. This is increasingly looking like a bottom. We felt at the time that this was the low point with the seasonality, which we'll look at in a minute. All we really need is to see Brent above this sort of 36.25 level, and that will become like the beginning of a higher low and then a higher high, the start of a new counter trend or move or an uptrend. And we're seeing here the correlation with the dollar is positive at the moment, so that's quite interesting as well. Normally it's the other way around. Commodities fall, the dollar while the dollar is rising, or vice versa, but at the moment the correlation is positive, so you don't need to pay too much attention to what the dollar is doing right now. It means they can both go up on the same day, whereas normally they would do the reverse of one another. If we look at the medium-term trend, of course this is our roadmap, this is the cloud chart. The medium-term trend, we're below the cloud, we turned bearish in 2015, many of you recall this is when we turned very bearish on oil prices. We've got a lot of work to do to get back into bullish territory. That lagging line needs to get all the way back up to around $45 before we'd start to have any chance of reversing this medium-term trend. So what that tells us is that we could have a recovery up to around the mid-40s and still be bearish. So that is quite interesting. And of course the seasonality is the thing that we look to the whole time. We are in this better time of year. Don't be surprised to see oil prices rising in the next few months. That's what happened last year. We had this counter trend move where we do get a rise in prices and then fall away. So if oil does make new lows, then it will probably be later in the year rather than any time soon. But we need to obviously just keep an eye on that situation. But at the moment, it looks like prices are in for a temporary rise, some respite. So really interesting there. If we look at the 60-minute chart, this is our shorter term roadmap where we're thinking what's going to happen in the days ahead, this week, and we've again turned bullish here. This does show how we are very much in this move up, move down that is not as great, and then a move up again. But remember, we do have that medium-term trend hanging over us, so we've got to be aware of that. And here's the low points we saw back in January. But interestingly, that we've found support at a higher level than we did previously. And remember, from a charting perspective, that's positive. If we move above 36 for a few hours, that would be pretty bullish in the short term for the price. Of course, we're above the cloud now, so we should expect moves to the upside on this time frame. If you hold the shift key and press T on your Updata system, of course, on any chart, we do still have these downside targets hanging over us. We're not getting a lot of trends here. If you, in the bottom right hand corner, if you click to this minus sign, quite often you will get other trends and targets emerging. 34.40, that's 3% upside, still not taking us higher than that 36, but we still do have that downside target hanging over us as well. So worth remembering that. And if we look at WTI, much the same story, of course. We're through on the clouds. That's turned bullish for the week ahead, but not a lot of upside targets here on this time frame. Again, if we go to the lower targets, we see that we are actually just last Friday we're meeting the targets that were given. So we may see a pullback. There's about 2% upside, so there's around 3%. We may well see a pullback before generating another thrust target. Of course, if you're trading crude, again coming off your Thomson Reuters icon, Shift T on the 1 minute chart will give you the trends and targets. And here we see that same 3% upside. If we do get upside targets, it's going to show up on your 1 minute charts first, so keep an eye out on that. If we take a look at US NatGas, here we see that we have started to move back down. We're back below $2 on Henry Hub. This time of year, the seasonality is not great. We do get a bit of a respite in the middle of the year before we fall away again. But really interesting, if we just look at the daily chart without doing any analysis, we see here lower, low, and then lower again, and lower highs. Really is making signs of going back to test the lows that we saw previously. We see here on the weekly cloud, this is bearish. On the daily cloud, we're below here. That's bearish as well. We see here how we haven't managed to get above the cloud. It puts us in a bearish frame of mind for NatGas. If we take a look at this chart, the point and figure targets, 138 is the downside target. Very hard to believe, but then so were these targets, 265 and 248. These targets given way back when the price was much higher. So we do have this target hanging over us. There is a counter trend one, but with all this downward pressure, we would favor the downside target. And if we look at the 60-minute chart, we see here back below the cloud, what we see is very typical. Big moves down, small counter trend moves, big moves down, sideways, big moves down. This is consistent with price behavior when the overall trend is down. Shift T again on your Updata system, and we have downside targets of 187, 179, 187. Two targets to 187, that's what we call a cluster. That's looking like where we're going to go next. So does look pretty bearish for the price. And of course, if you're trading Henry Hub, a lot of our clients in Houston trading Henry Hub, Shift T on your 1 minute chart, downside targets 190, 187. That one not yet activated. We need a new low below 193 to activate that. But interestingly, we've still got quite a lot of downside in the very short term on the 1 minute chart. Remember, this is really thinking about what's going to happen in the coming hours, the next day, so we do need to be just aware of that as well. So if we take a look at European gas and power, and a big focus for us this week with the E-World event, and these prices coming off the Updata energy feed, real-time consolidated broker data, but of course you can also run that off your Trayport screen as well. So if you're running Trayport, plug straight into Updata, and the great thing is you can actually cross-compare your Trayport data and your Thomson Reuters icon data. So here we see a correlation between MBP front month chart and the crude oil price coming from Thomson Reuters. So this chart here is actually a combination of Trayport data and Thomson Reuters data, and you can do that with your spreads, your sparks, your darks, etc. You can actually bring that data together from the two different places to arrive at these charts in real time. But we see here that MBP, we've actually written, especially for E-World, a report on European gas and power, giving the targets to where we see the bottom is for these products, and really interesting in that there's lots of downside targets which we don't have enough time to go into here, but the trend here is down, and we can see very much that the correlation with Brent is very strong. So if Brent does recover, we may see a little bit of respite in European gas markets as well. So that's front month MBP, below the cloud and bearish. We need to get all the way back above 37 really for that to turn bullish again. That's a long way from 28 at the moment. If we look at the 60-minute chart, here we see we get some temporary moves above the cloud, so a little bit of short-term bullishness, but soon again we're back into that bearishness. A lot of support here around the 28.50 level. That level looks like it will come under pressure. Shift T on your chart, and that gives you the trends and targets. 26.50, 26.75, that's about 6 or 7% downside. Look at how these targets, this one here given at 32.50, 28.85, given and met. Targets from much higher levels given and met. You really cannot ignore these targets when you see them. One of the great things on Updata is they're pre-programmed in your system. And of course, if you're trading gas very short term, sitting at your screen, the 1 minute charts, again, off your Trayport data, all the real-time broker data, all from the Updata energy feed. Shift T gives you the trends and targets. 27.50, 26.70, those are the downside targets, and we've got this downtrend. There is an upside target, but it's not yet activated, and we'd favor the downside. So that is where we're looking at this week. So not looking at like a great week ahead for gas prices. If we look at TTF, here's the daily chart on TTF. Again, very bearish. We need to get all the way back above 17 euros, and at the moment we're around 12, so that looks like a big ask. And we've got some quite big downside targets on TTF as well. If we look at the 60-minute chart, Shift T, 11.35, 10.80. Will it fall below 10 euros? This is the big question, and we do cover that in the report. If we take a look at NCG, and Gaspool, again this is broker data. Shift T, real-time broker data, 10.95 is the current level. We need to break below 12.25 for that to be activated. And if we take a look at the Gaspool chart, that was NCG, take a look at the Gaspool chart, Shift T, and we see here 11.28, another 10% downside, 9% downside. So really quite worrying, and looking like a pretty bad week ahead for European gas. Of course, the one thing we expect at this time of year is maybe a weather shock, and we cover that in the report as well. That shows up a little bit in the seasonality. If we look at European power, power prices really have fallen off a cliff. I was seeing a large decline in Germany last week, and we're discussing how low it could go, and we again have covered that in the report. But German power looking like it's got further to fall. We are getting a little bit of a respite here, but realistically, is that the bottom? Really hard to say. Notice when we get these big lurches down, we then do get a period of sideways consolidation, so we may just see a little bit of that. But the chart is very bearish, and we need to recover by about 20% at the moment for the price to turn bullish. So really quite worrying there. If we look at the 60-minute chart, here we see, if you go back and look at the 60-minute chart on German power, here we see big moves down, sideways, big moves down. So we may just be going into a consolidation phase, but history is showing that they're not that longly lived, maybe a week or two before we then have another lurch down. Shift T is giving you the trends and targets. We do have this upside target to 22.80, which would be a nice move, but we have to activate that, and when that needs a move around about 21.40, 21.45, we need to move above for that to be activated. Of course, if we go to the smaller box sizes, we see here that we at the moment are waiting for the next downward thrust, so that's quite key as well. If you look at the 1 minute chart, this is where it's going to show up first, and this again is real-time consolidated broker data. The 1 minute charts give you that granularity that you don't get on the daily and 60-minute charts. And here we see 20.45 is downside, 21.75. So really quite interesting that we've got this counter trend move going on. If we decrease the box size even further, we start to see 19.70, 20.45. So this is quite key as well. So just keep an eye on those point and figure targets too. If we take a look at Nordpool looking pretty bearish below, and we cover that in the report as well. Next of all, we looked at Forex. Dollar has had a bad start to the year, so we've been quite bullish on the dollar in the long term. We see this as a big consolidation phase before the next move up. We cover the euro dollar very briefly in our report this week, but what's interesting here is if we look at the dollar index, just starting to make moves above, so that will be quite interesting. Of course, so much hangs on the euro dollar, and if we look at the The daily chart of the euro dollar, again, prices coming from your Thomson Reuters icon system. Daily chart of the euro dollar, we see here that we're above on the daily chart, back above the cloud, but we are on this big range, this 105, 115 range. Until we break that, it's very hard to call where the next big moves are in euro dollar. And if we take a look at the 60-minute chart, here we see we're just turning bearish again, having nudged the 113.75 level. We're now just back below the cloud. So this is looking a little bit bearish this week for the euro on the basis of this chart. Shift T gives you the trends and targets. We do have these upside targets, so we are still bullish on this chart, but watch out for pulling back. And of course, if you're watching Eurodollar very closely, the 1 minute point and figure charts, again, prices from your Thomson Reuters icon, Shift T will give you the trends and targets. Notice how this trend has just turned bearish, and then if we see the downside targets just starting to emerge, no big thrust targets, so it's not implying that we're going to see big sharp moves to the downside, but at the moment euro just looking a little bit weaker this week. If we take a look at the other currency pairs, here we look at sterling below the cloud on the dollar, just a little bit bullish as we come back above on the 60-minute chart. Where will sterling go? Really in this range at the moment, around the 144, 145.70 level. Shift T, and we do have conflicting trends and targets, so that is key to watch this week. Again, conflicting targets, so it looks like sterling dollar could go either way. If we look at euro sterling, we see sterling is actually strengthening again against the euro. We saw a lot of euro strength kicking in here, so that's just interesting too. Norwegian kroner strengthening as well. We're seeing euro weakening just generally, same with the Swiss franc, and here we see sterling Swiss really just weak sterling here versus the Swiss, just nudging those 140 levels. So just a failure to break that 155 mark there. Last of all, we take a look at stock markets. We saw a big recovery in the S&P at the end of last week, about 2% upside at the end of the week. We're still very bearish on this weekly chart. Just remember, this move below the cloud is a bearish move, lower high, lower low. This is not a bullish looking picture. A lot of people saying the market's going to recover at these levels, but just remember, when we crossed these levels last time, this is when we start to see the big falls. So it's been a very successful signal, only 4 of them given in the last 20 years. This is a sell signal in the long term. It's saying the months ahead are potentially going to be tough in the markets. Below on the daily, below on the 60-minute. So we haven't even recovered in the short term. On the 60-minute chart, we need to get back above this 1900 level to turn bullish. These two downside targets suggesting 20% downside from here. Lots of support, so we're probably going to just struggle around these levels, but really interesting that we've got 2 downside targets. That's a cluster. Very hard to ignore those targets. Another one here. Downside to around the 1500 mark, and even on the short-term chart, remember this is the 60-minute chart, even though we had this big recovery on Friday, we don't have any really clear upside potential targets. Still got downside of 5% hanging over us in the short term. So I wouldn't be surprised to see stock markets having another bad week. Of course, the US market closed today for President's Day, but we will see how it opens tomorrow. And if we look at the Nasdaq, much the same picture here. If we look at the short-term picture on the Nasdaq, key here that we've got just above on the weekly still. We can actually just zoom in on that chart just to see that we're still just above the cloud on the lagging line, but we wouldn't be surprised to see that coming through with all the targets and what's been going on with the S&P and the Dow. We do have downside targets here as well on the Nasdaq, around 6-7% downside, and this looking very bearish. No real downside potential on the 1% chart, interestingly, but this 0.5% chart is a very clear target. So that's just quite interesting as well. Take a look at Footsie. Footsie we see below on the weekly, below on the daily, below just on the 60-minute, trying to get back through on the cloud there. But look at these downward targets, lots of downside targets, no upside in the medium to long term, downside targets again. So don't this is just a counter trend move at the moment, so it's, calling this as a bottom is just too early. Remember, calling bottoms and tops is a mug's game. At the moment, you've really got to wait for the trend to change before you can start to do that. So bearish here on the DAX. DAX down nearly 20% this year at one point. So here bearish on the DAX, on the weekly, on the daily, on the 60-minute downside target. We don't have the big downward targets on the 1% chart, but we do on the 60-minute chart. 20% downside from here, another one about 9% downside. That's a bearish chart. Whichever way you paint the picture, that's a bearish chart. If we look at the short term, there is a big recovery in the DAX this morning, but what's interesting is that we've still got that that bearish picture overall. Take a look at the Nikkei. Nikkei had a very strong showing overnight, up 7%, so really strong showing, but we are below the cloud on the weekly, the daily and the 60-minute. This volatility that we're seeing in markets is a real sign of the uncertainty that we face, but really a bearish picture. China closed last week for Chinese New Year, open again. Pretty quiet this morning, but what's interesting is that we do again have this downside target on China, 40% downside on that target, so that is pretty worrying, and this is a new target as well. We can actually put a target on there. That's going to be a very big downside target, 47% downside. So China has lots of downside. We need to be just very wary of calling a recovery in the Asian markets. Here we see the daily chart, also the daily and the 60-minute chart below. The short-term charts, if you're trading China, look at how these targets were given and met. We do have some upside targets, but the next move is anyone's guess. Just keep a very close eye on that. If we look at the Sensex index, the Indian market, a bit of recovery overnight as well. We see here that it's still bearish on all time frames, so we do still have quite a bit of downside. And if we last of all, just take a look at the Aussie market. Aussie is bearish on the weekly, bearish on the daily, bearish on the 60-minute, not really recovering, and a lot of downside. Look at these targets, 16% downside. If we look at the 0.5% chart, we see here just lots of downside targets, 9%, 16% on the 0.5% chart, and even on the 60-minute chart, where we're not seeing such clear targets in the other markets, 14%, 7%, 11%, lots of downside potential there. So the Aussie market not looking great. That's it for this week. Until next week, happy charting. See you then.